Today we wanted to talk about Barrick Gold, which is ticker GOLD. The stock is up just a tremendous amount today. It's up 7.5% after great earnings. Had been pretty beaten up into the election, and the election kind of started the ball rolling back for gold and metals as a whole. And this was obviously the name that Buffett was mentioned as buying, a couple months back now, and the earnings just crushed it, and so we're up 7-8%. What's interesting about that is if you check out our equity hub, the equity hub allows you to view 3,600 different names or 3,500 different names, all sorts of ETFs and stocks alike. So we just type in gold here and pull this name up. And so this setup itself, this is yesterday's setup. In other words, it doesn't incorporate today's volume, but you can see that 30 is kind of this inflection point, and that's where the stock kind of stopped today or stalled out today, and that kind of makes sense. It's kind of a fancy round number, and people like that. So what's interesting about it is that there's a lot of deltas, which means there's a lot of in-the-money options for January. So those are longer-term positions, and the biggest calls are at 30 strikes. So I think there's a lot of 30 strike January calls in the name. So if it gets up into this area, it could really take off. Not necessarily based on this picture, but what I want to show you is this picture. So we have this new history feature, which shows you the last 5 days in the name, how all these positions have changed in terms of options. So notice the call volume here, about 30,000. So it's a very call heavy name, more calls trade than puts. Today's volume is 80,000 calls. So that is going to change this picture dramatically. And so we had this situation kind of in the middle of the summer where silver and gold was really hot, and calls and all these different names really picking up. So now we have a situation where these names are crushing earnings, and I think that's because the spot price is much higher than maybe where they forecast earnings. So they're having good earnings around that. I'd leave that to the metal analysts to check that out. But gold as a whole is picking up. So these names have the a tailwind of good earnings. The metals are picking up, and so call buyers are coming in, and that could really change this dynamic. As you know, when people buy calls, dealers are short calls, and so dealers need to buy the stock to hedge themselves. And so the more calls that are purchased, the more that can push the name higher. And so, gold's particularly interesting. The other, thing about this is if you got to figure if Buffett's buying it, if you're interested in the gold industry, that's a name that's probably a pretty solid name, right? There's some other miners that you can look up in here that, have similar profiles and maybe are a little more speculative. The nice thing about gold is you got to figure that Buffett kind of checked it out a little bit and knows the fundamentals are sound if he selected that name. So something to watch. We'll keep an eye on that and see what comes of it. Take it easy.